though, we can't know what will result from all this effort. We have to do it anyway, not knowing in advance what will happen. Black voters, 1966 in Alabama, top of the ticket. Turns out they were not able to stop Third Lady Wallace. She won the Democratic primary anyway, and then she became governor. And so the Wallace regime kept its grip on the neck of the state with that little trick inside the Wallace marriage. But what those voters did in Alabama mattered. For one thing, part of the way you can tell is it ended up being national news on all those black voters who turned out in Alabama in 1966. They advanced black candidates for the state legislature, even for county sheriffs. The New York Times sent reporters 1,000 miles to go cover it. Quote, Mrs. Iona Morgan, 64 years old, wearing a hat and a bright red dress, admitted with a giggle that she had had to work up her nerve to go into the Lowndes County Courthouse and cast her first ballot. She said, seemingly surprised, quote, it wasn't nothing bad. Another voter, William Bolden, 81 years old, whose grandparents were slaves, took a more positive view. It felt good to me, he said, drawing himself up to his full 5 feet 3 inches. It made me think I was sort of somebody. The next county over from Lowndes County was Dallas County, home to Selma, where the local sheriff was on the ballot that year. The same sheriff who had charged the marchers on horseback, where John Lewis remembered seeing his own death on that bridge, where the Voting Rights Act was born. The sheriff who did that was on the ballot for re-election in 1966. And you know, what happened on that bridge was not an outlier in the tenure of that sheriff. Even before he sent the horses into the crowd on that Edmund Pettus Bridge, Sheriff Jim Clark had been a menace to Selma for years. When high school kids in Selma demonstrated for black voting rights, Sheriff Jim Clark ran them out of town. Look at them. I mean it literally. Look at them running. He literally ran them out of town in a forced march that reportedly involved cattle prods. Kids. 2 days later, Sheriff Clark went to the hospital with chest pains, and the kids, who he had run out of town, knelt outside the courthouse and prayed for him to recover. You believe that photo? That's the kind of sides we had, right? That's the kind of people who were on two different sides of the fight that year. The one side hitting kids with electric cattle prods, and then the kids who would pray for the man who was torturing and persecuting them. You can see Sheriff Jim Clark there in the white helmet. The following year, that's him there in the white helmet, trying to personally intimidate a man who'd come to register to vote under the new Voting Rights Act. Why are you wearing your helmet, sir? Is that your gun on your hip? In the months leading up to that 1966 election, where Sheriff Clark was on the ballot, the sheriff sometimes used force, as you can see here. As he tried to stop new voters from registering, he was violent against black voters with no compunction. Sometimes instead he stood by and laughed and jeered at them personally as the black people he supposedly served in that county lined up to become his voting constituents. When they lined up by the hundreds on election day and waited their turn to vote, Sheriff Jim Clark then did his best to stop the counting of their ballots. As sheriff, he personally challenged the contents of whole ballot boxes, entire ballot boxes from 6 minority precincts. He said they were all fraudulent and those votes shouldn't be counted. This is how one lawyer from the U.S. Justice Department remembers that moment in time. This was written up in the American Bar Association years later. It quotes Justice Department Attorney John Rosenberg. Quote, Rosenberg recalls that counting the ballots took a long time. And when 6 predominantly black wards hadn't finished by late evening, the county's Democratic Executive Committee picked up the boxes and refused to count their ballots. Rosenberg says, quote, we filed a civil rights action to require them to include the ballots. We weren't talking about who would win or lose, but the ballots in those boxes needed to be counted. That action, that day, in that election in Alabama, the year after the Voting Rights Act was passed, the local sheriff who had beat the hell out of people protesting for black voting rights took it to the next step on election day, tried to block black votes from being counted. That day, that election, that crucible was the first time the federal government intervened in an election like that under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to protect the votes of Black Americans. Justice Department lawyers entered into a civil rights action to make sure those ballots from those black wards were counted. And it worked. They took it to court. The court ordered that all the votes be counted, even the black ones, even though it was later in the evening than anyone expected. Rosenberg remembers, quote, "We were before Judge Daniel Thomas, which we were worried about because he'd been slow in desegregating schools. He was more conservative. But Judge Thomas ordered that the ballots be counted, and the result of that counting was that Jim Clark was out. Sheriff Jim Clark was out. The voters had voted. The votes got counted. And the worst of the worst was out. He lost. Governor's race did not go their way that day. But the sheriff, who very nearly killed John Lewis, the sheriff who butchered his way through peaceful protesters on that bridge in Selma, who terrorized the people of his city and jeered at them and laughed in their faces and intimidated them personally, tried to block them from voting, tried to block their votes from being counted if they could manage to vote, he failed. They voted, and they voted him out that day in 1966, decisively.